Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Newton Community Farms YouTube channel. For those of you who I may not have met already, my name's Hope. I'm the Director of Education here at Newton Community Farm, and I'm excited to be joining you again to talk about gardening and farming. If you were able to join us on Monday, we talked to Lar, and he told us all about how to use food more efficiently, talked a lot about food waste. And so that's kind of a great way to segue into gardening and thinking about how to best take care of our land to produce abundant food that we can then use in delicious recipes in sustainable ways. So today, we're approaching May and we're totally in spring and we're enjoying a lot of the spring rain, and we're probably more so enjoying these sunnier days like today. And if you're a gardener or a farmer here in Massachusetts or New England, you're probably getting the swing of your growing season. So you're probably either planting some things in the ground or at least thinking about what you could plant in the ground and ordering some seeds or ordering seedlings. And it's an exciting time, and it's exciting to be about the best practices for taking care of your land, taking care of your crops for this upcoming season. So with that being said, I thought today would be a great opportunity and moment in our growing timeline to talk about organic growing and what that means and what that looks like, mostly on the small scale side for a home grower or gardener, but also we'll kind of talk about what organic practices look like on a production farm like Newton Community. And we'll use Newton Community Farm as our kind of example for organic practices, organic growing, because that's the system that I'm familiar with right now, and I think that we can glean a lot of really useful practices and ideas from some of the things that the farm team is doing at Newton Community Farm. So that's our topic for the day. And as always, you can contribute any thoughts or ideas or questions in the chat box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, or maybe at the bottom of your screen, depending on how you're oriented. And we love to be able to engage with folks on this platform. It's the big benefit of being live. So if you have anything to please send it into the chat box and I'll do my best to address. So being said, let's jump into organic. So organic, it might seem like a big buzzword today. It's something that we hear when we think about growing food, when we think about eating food. And it's a great thing to be paying attention to, but I like to remember anytime I'm having a conversation around organic, that organic really is the baseline. It's the way that food has been grown for most of human history. And it's really just been in the past century or so that we've moved away from organic, at least in our industrial agriculture model. So I think that thinking about organic as kind of the baseline, it makes the process of going organic or starting an organic garden, I think, feel a bit daunting, because it's not necessarily this how do I want to put it? It's not necessarily a revolutionary thing that would necessarily take any expertise or any real expertise. It's really just getting back to basics and getting away from chemical herbicides and everything like that, to benefit our health, but to get back to nature, healthy, ecological landscape and where we're growing. So if that helps the daunting side of organic, I think it makes sense to jump into how we define organic. So from the USDA, we hear organic defined as biological and cold and mechanical practices that support, foster a cycling of resources, promotes biodiversity, and they promote the conservation of biodiversity and ecological balance in our systems. So that's kind of a convoluted description of what organic can be understood as. It looks like in practice, so it looks like not spraying our crops or at least not spraying our crops with anything that is not a certified organic pesticide or something that's a bit more chemical. So a lot of people or growers who are aiming to be organic still might use sprays when they need to, but they time it well with their crops, and they might, and we'll talk about that a bit later, timing, but they might wait until they really need it, kind of use it with a bit of discretion before going ahead and introducing anything unnatural to their growing landscape. Some other ways that we see organic practices played out in farms and garden is crop rotation, which we've talked about in earlier garden episodes. And we'll dive into each of these kind of individually a bit later on in the episode. We see natural pest control and natural fertilizers, which are all things that are definitely within the realm of home growers being able to implement, which is great for all of us who want to grow a little plot of land at home and are thinking about ways that we can feed our family and ourselves. So some of the benefits of going organic, and we can think about these, or at least I think about these as kind of a three-pronged approach to the benefit of organic. So first we see human health. So when we eat organic food, or at least food that hasn't been grown with a big input of anything chemical or unnatural, we see better physical health. We often see improved mental health when we're not exposed to as many chemicals. We probably don't have as much brain fog or things like that. And we see emotional health. If we get outside, especially during quarantine, to get our hands in the dirt, use our minds in planning and making decisions about growing outside in our garden, that's an emotional benefit. And then knowing that we're feeding ourselves and our families healthy, clean food is another emotional boost. And it makes us, I think it makes myself, I'll speak for myself, feel a bit more in control during a time that we might feel, I know I feel like I don't have as much control as I have in the past with all of these restrictions and all of these kind of changes that we're experiencing throughout our society right now. So that's one prong of the benefits of organic, is we see human health. We see environmental and ecological health. So we see healthier soil, which we know leads to healthier food. We see healthier animal populations and insect populations, which is another big thing that we'll talk about with natural pest repellent. And we see less water used to grow crops and less water contaminated by chemicals running off into other water sources from our farmland. We see higher crop yields in the end. Healthier ecosystems can develop and produce more food. And we often see lower energy use, especially when we're removing some of the machinery that we might see in other farm systems. We see better use of energy. And the final prong of the three-pronged benefits of organic growing is community health. So when we're growing organic ourselves, we might encounter an issue with growing that inspires us to go down the street and talk to our neighbor from 6 feet apart about what they might be doing in their garden that we can do in ours. So I think there are a lot of ways that growing ourselves or supporting local growers by CSA or by going to farmers markets, there's a lot of community building elements that come out of growing ourselves and supporting local growers, whether or not they're organic. But a lot of times we see these smaller farms doing their best to implement organic practices. And I think no matter where you're buying food and no matter who your market is as a grower, there's a lot of peace of mind for consumers when you know that there are some organic practices that are being adhered to. So that's a bit of the definition of organic growing. So basically, to summarize, it's working with an ecological system or landscape in harmony with it, rather than kind of overriding or fighting against it with chemicals or anything that's unnatural being introduced to the landscape. And it's a returning to this kind of basic human growing of agriculture, of food, rather than this kind of last century of introducing foreign pesticides and herbicides to our landscapes. So we'll kind of dive into organic as it applies to the different elements of growing food that we often associate with introducing non-organic materials into our garden. So to me, I think those are pests and disease, and I think that those have a lot to do with weeds and bugs. So I'm thinking mainly pest, disease, and weeds. So a typical farm is going to be loaded with bugs. And whether or not it's organic or conventional and non-organic, there'll be a plethora of bugs in your garden. And some are going to be parasites. So we see things like flea beetles, potato beetles, aphids, snails and slugs, hornworms. There are tons of pests, and maybe these names are familiar to you, and maybe you have seen some of these in your garden before. Learning to identify pest insects, I think, is beneficial. I've worked in farming environments where the biggest pest issue was potato beetles, and we would actually spend a couple of hours a week at least going through the potato plants and picking the potato beetles off one and ridding intense are other control pests. But it's definitely helpful to be identifying landscape. Pests are going to be the most problematic for you. So one way of approaching these parasitics is introducing bad insects. So these insects work for you by somehow exterminating or working against pest insects. So there are a few kind of categories of beneficial insects. One of them is natural enemies. So these kind of just whatever insects are creating a problem in your garden. So one that you might have seen if you've worked outside in a garden or a farm before is called a hoverfly. And they almost actually look a little bit like tiny, tiny bees. And you can tell that they're hoverflies because they kind of flit around and then they'll hover in one spot and then they'll fly away to another area. And they eat aphids, which are tiny little green bugs that you sometimes find on the bottom of a leaf on a crop. And aphids can be a big problem for a lot of farmers and growers, definitely parasitic. So hoverflies, if you see those in your garden, those are actually a great bug to have around because those eat those aphids that might be causing problems in other ways for you on your crop. We see parasitoids, and these are, I think, one of the most interesting types of beneficial insects that I've seen in action on a farm. And these work against parasitic bugs in a number of ways, but one of those laying eggs in parasitic bugs to eventually exterminate those bugs. So an example of those is parasitic wasps, which the name sounds a little bit bad and a little bit scary, like they might be doing something negative in your garden. But parasitic wasps, if you've ever seen a hornworm, so they can be about this big and they're just these thick, plump green caterpillars. And if you've ever seen those, I've seen them really loving on cherry tomatoes. They seem to like tomatoes in my history, but I think they like a number of things. So what we see with parasitic wasps and how they impact those hornworm populations, they actually go into the hornworm, lay eggs inside of the hornworm. The eggs hatch and eat the hornworm from the inside out. And then they leave the hornworm and it's eventually covered with all these little sacs of larvae, baby wasps, and the hornworm is killed. So it's pretty brutal, but something like, yeah, it's I just got a comment in the chat box that says ew. It's pretty gross to see, but it's a pretty amazing natural phenomenon. I've seen hornworms that have been covered with these little white, very, very tiny, that are just sticking out of the hornworm. And I won't go into any more detail with that, but that's another example of a beneficial insect in your garden. And finally, there are pollinators, which most of us are familiar with. These include bees are the most popular ones, and pollinators are traveling around your garden making sure that your crops are going from their flowering stage into their production stage. So this is a really important element of most gardens, is having these pollinators. So if you see, for example, a squash plant in the early spring, or not even just early, but in its early stages of being a growing plant in the ground, you'll see its big, beautiful yellow flower, which is pretty quintessential of squash plants. And these pollinators are essential in turning that flower into the eventual squash or zucchini or whatever is going to be yielded from that plant. So pollinators carry a really big responsibility in most of our gardens. So that's a quick overview of what insects look like in a garden. So how to support those insect populations, particularly our beneficial insects like our pollinators. How can we support those in our gardens, in our farmland? So one way that we can support that is through planting flowers that attract pollinators and beneficial insects. So, we see for the learning garden at Newton Community Farm, I just recently purchased a mix of flowers that is specifically designed for attracting beneficial insects. So I'm going to be planting some things that I know will attract insects this season. So, for example, I am growing a lot of brassicas, so that includes kale and broccoli and radish, and there's all sorts of different plants in that family that I know will be attracting certain kinds of bugs. So as a preventative measure, because I don't want to have to use sprays in the learning garden, and I definitely would never, because it's such a hands-on place when it is in action outside of quarantine time. I am thinking of ways that I can preventatively bring in some insects that might combat the insects that'll go after my brassicas. So some of the plants that are going to be in this mix, I know there'll be poppies, which are a big attractant of beneficial insects and pollinators. There'll be some sweet alyssum, which is another, kind of looks like Queen Anne's lace, and that's another really good plant to bring in insects and pollinators. And I think one of the most popular, and I saw this come up in the chat box, is marigold. And I've seen folks plant one marigold at the end of each bed. Marigold have such an amazing reputation for attracting beneficial insects that in turn, somehow take care of the parasitic insects that we don't want around, so that we can use less and less chemical and unnatural input. So because I like to bring something green into each of these episodes, this is a little example of some marigold sprouts that I've been growing at home. These will probably end up in the learning garden at Newton Community Farm. I hope you can see it okay. So if you've ever seen a full-grown marigold, they have similar leaves as this. They're quite a bit, they're angular and they're a bit jagged, but they're smooth to the touch, and they'll grow beautiful little orange flower blossoms, and those will attract a lot of really beneficial plants for insects and pollinators for the learning garden, which is great news. So if you are thinking of spraying any insecticides in your garden, it's not always feasible for everyone to go organic, especially if we don't have all the time to take care of, weeding and doing certain things that will benefit our gardens. It's important to think about timing. So when you see your plants flowering, like the zucchini example that I mentioned, when you see that bright yellow flower coming off of your squash or zucchini plant, that would be a good time to hold off on spraying, because we know that pollinators are still going to be attracted to the flower, and they're still going to be visiting that flower to help pollinate it to produce the vegetable and to produce the yield that we're looking for. So, maybe avoiding spraying during that window of time, so that we can keep our pollinators healthy and happy and do a job, rather than spraying during the time frame that they need to be visiting our crops. So thinking of timing, I think, is important. And yeah, I think there are a lot of ways that we can we can still use whichever practices are best for us while thinking of ways that incrementally we introduce organic practices. It doesn't have to be this big, huge leap. If you've used any pesticides in your garden in the past, it can be an incremental growth into organic growing. So that said, I think the other side of that coin is talking about disease in our gardens, which is another reason that some folks might introduce non-organic elements into their growing practice. So we we can find things, if we plant the nice flowers that'll attract all that we want, and we lay down all the compost and do all of those great things, and we still have an issue with certain disease or pests, there are organic pesticides and fertilizers on the market. I know I've seen plenty on Johnny's website, which is where Newton Community Farm buys most of our seeds. And they provide a really transparent and a really broad range of different kinds of organic pesticides for those moments when we might really need a little boost of support in our gardens. I think there are still some other things that I would like to touch upon that are good preventative measures before we get to that point, but I do like to mention it because we don't have to resort to things like Roundup or its equivalents, because there's evidence to know that those materials are quite a bit more harmful than beneficial, and there are alternatives on the market for sure. So promoting organic growth and reduction of disease in our crops. There are a number of ways that we can do that in our gardens. And I'd like to talk about how Newton Community Farm approaches disease control and organic growth because it can be such a productive model for us to look at. So one way to produce organically and to encourage organic growth and healthy soil is compost. So using an organic compost is a really great way to add nutrient and vitamin content to our soil, and it's an all natural way to do that. So rather than using something synthetic synthetic like a fertilizer to add certain nutrients, compost is a great way to build up our soil health. And it's still something that we can trust in growing our food in, right? We can grow healthy food in compost rather than fertilizer. But sometimes fertilizers aren't necessary. So at Newton Community Farm, we use an organic fertilizer from a chicken farm in New York, and it's mostly used in the early spring. So the early spring is when the ground is still pretty cold and the soil is cold, and some of the micronutrients that make something like nitrogen or phosphorus available for the plants to use, we're not seeing an abundance of that micro life early in the season when everything's still cold and the land is still waking up. So that's a great time to add a water soluble form of nitrogen, mostly nitrogen, to the soil in the form of an organic fertilizer. And as incrementally the season gets warmer and we see more and more activity in the soil, and it's producing more nitrogen by itself for the plants to access, we can slowly kind of wean off of using that fertilizer. But it is organic, and again, there are ways to boost our growing systems while still thinking about what we're putting into the landscape and whether or not it's 100% beneficial or whether or not it's doing some harm too. So there are also some fertilizers that are made from organic material like seaweed or like fish extracts and leftover fish parts, which also sounds kind of gross and it doesn't smell good, but it's a really healthy way to. So at Newton Community Farm, we use a fish emulsion mix, and it's a healthy way to give our little seedlings a shock of nitrogen and other nutrients before transplanting it into the soil. So when we take a little seedling like this, so pretty small, and it's in a block of soil, well, this would be a bit bigger when it goes in the ground, but this is kind of what a seedling would be like. We would let that soak in a fish emulsion to give it a shock of healthy nutrients before sending it into the elements outside of the greenhouse or the colder soil and the outside land. So there are other ways to that's another opportunity for us to introduce some more organic practices into our early planting phases in our gardens. But I would say fish emulsion is not for the faint of heart. It is pretty stingy, but it's an interesting way to introduce another form of waste, really, um, and make it a productive part of our growing process. And then another way for organic growth is cover crop. So cover crop is something that's planted at the end of the growing season in the fall, not only to hold soil into holding topsoil in so that it doesn't erode away during windstorms or rain during the off season. But cover crop also helps to hold nutrients into the soil and provide nutrients. For example, at Newton Community Farm, we use vetch quite a bit, which is a legume that holds in nitrogen into the soil. And when it's tilled over and turned over into the soil, beginning of the spring, which is something that our farmer is doing right now at Newton Community Farm, that crop will begin to decompose and make more nutrients available for whichever crop is planted after that. So using cover crop in the off season and then turning it over into the soil to decompose in the beginning of the spring is a good way to avoid having to use a fertilizer in your garden. So that might be a tip for someone who's looking ahead to thinking about health long term. So if you're going to be growing on a plot of land for the next few years at least, or maybe you're on the land that you hope to be growing well into the future, you can think about planting cover crops this fall to add a little boost of health to your land for next spring when things start to grow in the ground. So I think there are a couple other ways. There's crop rotation. That's the one I didn't want to forget. Crop rotation, we've talked about that in an earlier episode, but crop rotation is a good way to keep insects and disease from really kind of wreaking havoc in your garden. So if something's in the same family, like I'll use the brassica example again, we might decide, 1 year we'll plant our broccoli on the left-hand side of our garden. And then next year we'll plant our broccoli and our kale, our brassica family plants on the other side of our garden so that this one area of our garden doesn't become a difficult place to grow brassicas. So if we plant the same thing in the same spot over and over and over again, we'll see an increase of the pests that like that plant, an increase of the disease that like that plant, and an increase of the weeds that tend to thrive around that plant. So the more we rotate, the more we kind of throw off and throw a wrench into the plan of all of these negative elements of a garden, so weeds and disease and pests and the like. So I think weeds are another element of organic growing that I'd like to touch upon before we wrap this episode up, because weeds are a big reason why a grower might use a pesticide or another non-organic input into their gardens. So there are a few organic kind of preventative ways to handle weeds. One of them is definitely crop rotation. Again, if we plant the same thing over and over and over again, that plant will tend to take up certain nutrients from the soil and leave a different kind of ratio of nutrients available for other weeds to take. And they might kind of really get growing in that spot. Whereas if we rotate them around, the weeds will kind of have to adjust accordingly to whichever plant's in the bed at that certain time. So one way of preventing weeds is to lay down a tarp or mulch or even black plastic. I'll use the tarp example first. So if you use like a black recycled tarp, this is something that you would also see if you came to Newton Community Farm. It's a great weed management because the black that's laying down on the land will absorb all the sunlight and really warm up whatever's underneath the tarp. And the warmth will stimulate weed seed in the soil to germinate and sprout. And then the heat ends up killing those sprouts before they can grow big and strong and go back to seed and send their weed seed back into the soil. So that's also a long-term way of thinking about how to deal with pest management. It creates kind of an uninhabitable environment for weeds to grow in, and often an uninhabitable environment for plants to grow in as well. So that's why sometimes you might see a tarp laid down on a bed with little holes cut into it for the plant to grow through, which can be effective. I've seen that work for sweet potatoes. So the sweet potato sprout is planted in the hole in the black plastic in a neat little row, or in the black tarp rather, in a neat little row, so that they can grow up and out of the plastic and the weeds can stay suppressed underneath the heat of that tarp. So that's definitely a bit of an investment getting that kind of material. At Newton Community Farm, we use a biodegradable mulch, which is made from corn gluten. And it kind of looks like a plastic, but it doesn't. When it breaks down, it just breaks down organically back into the soil rather than breaking down into petroleum or bits of plastic that would end up going into the soil, which wouldn't be as healthy or beneficial for the land. So I think that's a lot of information to give for one session. If there are any questions before we wrap it up, I'd be happy to talk them through if you put them into the chat box. Otherwise, that's kind of a quick overview and hopefully an inspiration to think about ways that you can not even go organic in your garden, but introduce incrementally some organic input and some organic growing practices into whatever you're thinking about creating this spring. And it's definitely an exciting time. And I know I'm having a lot of fun thinking about what's going to be going in the ground at the Learning Garden at Newton Community Farm. And I'm definitely happy to be hearing about what other folks are putting in the ground. And with that being said, I think that's my cue to wrap up my organic conversation with all of you. If you've tuned in live, thanks for tuning in. And if you're watching this recorded, I hope that this is helpful for your growing practices. And best of luck getting out there and taking care of your garden in a way that's beneficial for both you and other consumers of what you grow, and also the land that you're growing on. So on Friday at 1 p.m., if you'd like to tune back in, we'll have story time with Sue. And as always, we have cooking and food-focused content with Jay on Mondays at 1. And we look forward to seeing you again, and any videos that we've recorded can always be seen right here on our website, on our YouTube website. Okay, take care and see you next time. Bye-bye.